In the late 1970s, a partially filled Coca-Cola bottle displayed in a bookstore window became the crucial element in uncovering a Soviet spy network that had operated covertly in close proximity to the Pentagon for over 3 years. At that moment, federal investigators were unaware that this common American soft drink communicated a message they had been attempting to decipher for several months. Once its meaning became clear, this case would be recognized as one of the most meticulously executed espionage operations of the Cold War. Since late 1975, the Federal Bureau of Investigation had been aware of a Soviet intelligence network operating somewhere within the greater Washington area. The evidence, though circumstantial, was consistently pointing towards this conclusion. Classified documents from the Department of Defense frequently surfaced in the possession of Eastern Bloc nations. These included technical specifications for satellite communication systems, internal evaluations of weapons procurement programs, and organizational diagrams detailing the security clearances held by various military officers. Such intelligence allowed Soviet analysts to systematically comprehend American capabilities. The FBI's Washington field office initiated a counterintelligence investigation in January 1976, codenamed Operation Quiet Pastor. 6 agents were assigned to identify what they believed to be an active espionage cell. For 2 years, the investigation yielded almost no results. Standard investigative protocols failed to identify any obvious suspects, suspicious financial transactions, or unexplained foreign contacts. The individuals responsible for pilfering American secrets had established a system so streamlined and compartmentalized that it left virtually no discernible trace, leading agents working the case to question if they were pursuing phantom leads. From this vantage point, the agents could maintain very limited visual contact with the bookshop, as their angle of sight was less than ideal, and the darkness made detailed observation difficult. The night stretched on, midnight came and went, then once, then 2. The bookshop remained still and dark, and the Coca-Cola bottle remained in the window. At approximately 4:55 in the morning, on December 9th, something changed. Special Agent Thomas Crawford noticed what he believed was movement inside the darkened bookshop. Crawford grabbed his binoculars and focused on the front window, his partner now alert and watching as well. They couldn't see clearly who was moving inside the shop. The angle and darkness made it impossible to identify any individual, but they could see a dim light as if someone turned on a lamp in the back. Then, as they watched, the Coca-Cola bottle disappeared from the window. One moment it was there, illuminated by the streetlight, and the next moment it was gone, removed by someone inside. Crawford documented the time in his notebook, 4:57 a.m. But even as he reached for the radio to report the development, both agents realized a crucial problem with their surveillance position. They could see the front of literarium books. They could see the front window and the front door. But they had no visibility on the back of the building. They couldn't see if someone had entered from a rear entrance. Couldn't see if someone was exiting right now through a back door. Couldn't see the alley that ran behind the commercial buildings on this block. No one had entered or exited through the front door. Of that, they were certain. The front door had remained locked and undisturbed throughout the night, but whoever removed that bottle had been inside the building, which meant there must be access from the rear, and they had no eyes on it. By 6 that morning, when the surveillance team reported back to the FBI field office, Robert Hensley convened an emergency meeting with the rest of the team investigators. The overnight surveillance had confirmed Michael Reeves's suspicion. The Coca-Cola bottle was indeed being used as a signal, and someone with access to literarium books was involved in removing it after the shop closed. But the surveillance had also revealed the operational security challenge they faced. They needed to watch both the front and the back of the building simultaneously, and they needed to do it without being detected. The solution came from Special Agent Sarah Mitchell, one of the team's more experienced surveillance specialists. She had noted that across the street from literarium books, above a hardware store, there was a second-floor apartment that appeared to be vacant. If they could rent that apartment, they'd have direct line of sight to the bookshop front, and depending on the unit's layout, they might be able to observe the entrance to the rear alley. Within 48 hours, the FBI had secured a 6-month lease on the apartment under the name of a shell corporation created for surveillance operations. The apartment was small, just a 1-bedroom unit with a living room, kitchenette, and bathroom, but its location was perfect. The front windows looked directly at literarium books. offering a clear view of the storefront and the display window. The bedroom window provided a partial view of the rear alley entrance, though the angle was imperfect. By December 12, 1978, the observation post was operational. FBI agents had installed professional surveillance equipment, including cameras with long lenses mounted on tripods, and were keeping detailed logs for documenting all activity. The apartment was staffed 24 hours a day with rotating two-agent teams working 8-hour shifts. Their orders were explicit. Observe and document everything related to literarium books. Note everyone who entered and exited the shop. Watch for the appearance of Coca-Cola bottles in the window. And if another bottle appeared, maintain continuous surveillance until someone removed it and attempt to identify that person. The surveillance team settled in for what they knew might be a long wait. Espionage networks operated on their own schedules based on the availability of intelligence and the opportunity to pass it safely. The Coca-Cola bottle might appear again tomorrow, or it might not appear for weeks. The FBI's job was to be watching whenever it did. Literarium books operated as a seemingly ordinary small business. The owner, whose name the FBI had quickly identified through property records as Ernest Caldwell, arrived each morning between 9:15 and 9:30, unlocked the front door, and opened for business at 10 Spurl. The shop's clientele was modest, but consistent. Neighborhood residents browsing for books, students from the nearby community college looking for required reading, occasional dealers searching for valuable first editions. The FBI agents photographed everyone who entered, cross-referencing faces against lists of known or suspected foreign intelligence officers. Ernest Caldwell himself appeared entirely ordinary. A 63-year-old former teacher who had owned the bookshop for nearly 8 years. Background checks revealed nothing suspicious. No foreign travel, no unexplained income, no known associations with diplomatic personnel or suspected intelligence operatives. He lived in a modest house in Arlington, drove a 10-year-old Chevrolet, attended a Lutheran church on Sundays, and by all appearances was simply a man who had found a quiet way to spend his retirement years doing something he enjoyed. The surveillance continued through December. Christmas approached and the street took on a festive character, with lights strung between street lamps and seasonal displays in shop windows. Literarium Books featured a holiday book selection in its front window. Children's stories, classic novels, gift sets of poetry, and essays, but no Coca-Cola bottles appeared. The FBI team began to wonder if somehow their presence had been detected, or if the network had changed its communication method. On January 3, 1979, at approximately 6:45 in the evening, a Coca-Cola bottle appeared in the front window of Literarium Books. Special Agent David Quinn was on watch in the observation post when he spotted it, and he immediately activated the full surveillance protocol. He radioed the command post at the FBI field office, notifying them that the signal had been placed, and he began photographing the bookshop systematically, documenting the bottle's exact position and the time of its appearance. Ernest Caldwell closed the shop at 7:06 as usual, flipped the sign to closed, pulled down the front shade, and locked the front door. The Coca-Cola bottle remained in the window, visible and waiting. The FBI had learned from their previous surveillance attempt, and this time they were determined not to miss whoever removed the bottle or whoever might approach the bookshop from any direction. The hours passed slowly. 8 hours came and went, then 9, then 10. The street quieted as businesses closed and residents settled in for the evening. The surveillance team maintained their watch, cameras ready, everyone alert for any movement. At approximately 4:30 in the morning, on January 4th, a car appeared approaching slowly. It was a dark-colored sedan. Special Agent Quinn, observing from the vantage point, seized his camera and started snapping photographs as the vehicle decelerated. However, it did not halt. It maintained its speed down the street until it vanished from sight. Agent Quinn found this to be unusual, yet not entirely out of the ordinary. Then, approximately 10 minutes later, his partner, monitoring the alley entrance from the other window, confirmed visual contact. A male figure had entered the alley. He appeared to be carrying nothing, merely walking purposefully in the pre-dawn gloom. The distance and poor illumination rendered it impossible to discern details, revealing only a silhouette that seemed to be a man in dark attire. For roughly 11 minutes, nothing discernible transpired. They observed the front window, watched the Coca-Cola bottle, and waited. Subsequently, a faint light illuminated in the rear of the bookshop. The agents could perceive a soft shadow behind the shade covering the window just as the bottle disappeared. Someone inside had removed it, precisely as they had done previously. The light extinguished, and less than a minute later, the male figure emerged from the back alley, walking towards the street. This time, however, he was carrying something, a small paper bag, roughly the size that might contain a paperback book. The agents at the observation post took photographs, endeavoring to capture the figure's face in the dim light, but the distance and darkness thwarted their efforts. They could discern that he was of medium height, medium build, wearing what appeared to be a dark jacket and dark pants, but they could not distinguish facial features or other identifying characteristics. The figure quickly disappeared from view, and the FBI agents faced an immediate dilemma: follow him and risk compromising their surveillance, or maintain their position and preserve their observation post for future operations. Robert Hensley had been explicit in his directives. The observation post was too valuable to jeopardize. If they alarmed the network now, they might shut down the entire operation before the FBI could identify all participants. The agents remained in position and allowed the figure to depart into the darkness. By 6 a.m. that morning, the surveillance team had documented the entire sequence of events: the signal placement at 6:45 the previous evening, the vehicle's arrival at 4:30, the figure entering the alley and emerging later with a paper bag. They possessed photographs, though none depicted the person's face clearly enough for identification. They had confirmation that the signal system functioned precisely as they had hypothesized. The bottle placed when material was ready, removed by someone accessing the shop from the rear after pickup was completed. The surveillance had confirmed how the network operated, but it had not yet identified who was feeding classified information into the system. The person picking up the material was clearly a courier, someone collecting packages. But somewhere upstream was the actual source, the insider with access to classified defense documents who was betraying his country. Robert Hensley outlined the next phase of the investigation. They knew the bookshop was the drop site. They knew the Coca-Cola bottles were a signal, and they knew someone picked up after the signal was placed. What they didn't know yet was who was dropping off. The FBI strategy shifted from passive observation to active identification. The surveillance team was instructed to photograph and document every person who entered Literarium Books, to note what they carried in and what they carried out, and to look for anyone who might be delivering material rather than just browsing for books. The team also began conducting deep background investigations on Ernest Caldwell, the bookshop owner. Financial records showed modest income, consistent with a small retail business. No unusual deposits or expenditures. Phone records showed calls to book wholesalers, local customers, his daughter in Richmond. There was nothing to suggest wealth or foreign connections. Nothing that would explain why he would risk everything to serve as a conduit for Soviet intelligence. The prevailing theory was that Caldwell had been recruited or coerced, that he was being paid or blackmailed to allow his bookshop to be used as a drop site. The surveillance continued through January. The observation post across the street documented the daily rhythm of Literarium Books, customers arriving and departing, Ernest Caldwell managing his business, closing procedures each evening. The FBI team photographed everyone, building a database of faces and patterns, looking for anomalies. On January 29th, the Coca-Cola bottle appeared again in the window at 6:50 in the evening, just before closing time. Then in August 1978, the situation dramatically changed. A CIA source, whose identity would remain so stringently protected that even the FBI counterintelligence team would never learn their name, provided critical information to their handler during a meeting held in a European capital. The source revealed that a Soviet intelligence network operating in the Washington area employed commercial products as signaling devices, specifically Coca-Cola bottles, to indicate when materials were ready for collection. The information was frustratingly imprecise. The source did not know the exact location where the signal was being used, nor the individuals using it. They also lacked knowledge of the specific configuration or placement that constituted an active signal as opposed to a mere discarded bottle. The surveillance team activated the full protocol, cameras recording, agents in position. That night at 4:43 in the morning, a vehicle arrived and a figure entered the alley, emerging minutes later with a paper bag after the bottle had been removed from the window. The pattern was identical to the previous pickup on January 4th. And once again, the FBI maintained surveillance discipline and didn't attempt to follow the courier. But now, the investigative team had a narrower window to focus on. They cross-referenced everyone who had entered literarium books in the days before the January 29th signal, with everyone who had entered before the January 4th signal. The analysis produced a list of roughly 24 individuals who had visited the shop during both time periods, regular customers whose presence appeared in multiple surveillance photographs. On February 21st, another signal appeared in the window. The pickup occurred early the next morning, just as before, and the FBI team added this date to their cross-reference analysis. When they compared customers who had visited the shop before all three signals, January 4th, January 29th, and February 21st, the list narrowed dramatically to just 6 individuals. 3 of these 6 were elderly women, regular customers whom the FBI quickly eliminated as suspects based on age and lack of access to classified materials. Another was a teenager, clearly too young to be working in the defense sector. That left 2 individuals who fit the profile of potential insider threats. A man in his late 30s who carried a briefcase and dressed in business attire, and a woman in her mid-40s who had visited the shop multiple times, carrying what appeared to be a purse or small bag. On March 14, 1979, at approximately 2:30 in the afternoon, the man with the briefcase entered Literarium Books. Special Agent Quinn, watching from the observation post, photographed him arriving. The man spent approximately 7 minutes in the shop, then departed, carrying his briefcase and walking to his car, parked half a block away. The FBI team immediately made the decision to follow the suspect. When he left the shop, to identify him fully and establish his connection to potential classified materials. 2 agents in an unmarked vehicle had trailed him from a distance as he drove through Arlington, eventually following him to a residential house on Crescent Drive in Alexandria. At 6:45 that evening, as Ernest Caldwell prepared to close Literarium Books for the day, a Coca-Cola bottle appeared in the front window. The correlation was impossible to ignore. Within hours of the man's visit, the signal had been placed. By late evening on March 14th, the FBI had obtained a name through property records and motor vehicle registration of the man they followed earlier that afternoon, Walter Ashford. Within 24 hours, the background investigation on Walter Ashford had revealed the critical connection the FBI had been seeking. He was employed by the Department of Defense, working as a clerk in a Pentagon office that handled classified procurement documentation. He had security clearance to access the exact type of materials that had been appearing in Soviet hands for the past several years. The case against Walter Ashford began to solidify rapidly. Financial records showed modest income consistent with his civil service salary. But there were irregularities, a pattern of cash deposits that didn't align with obvious sources and larger than average purchases. Through late March and early April 1979, Walter Ashford became the subject of intensive surveillance. FBI agents documented his movements from the moment he left his house each morning until he returned each evening. They observed his routine, the drive to the Pentagon, occasional lunch breaks, the evening commute home. They photographed everyone he met, every location he visited, looking for any contact with known or suspected foreign intelligence officers. Ashford appeared to live a thoroughly ordinary life. He was 41 years old, unmarried, no children, no apparent girlfriend or active social life. He went to work, came home, occasionally stopped at a grocery store or dry cleaner. On weekends, he sometimes attended a movie theater or visited a public library. There was nothing dramatic or suspicious in his behavior, nothing that would draw attention from a casual observer. But the FBI had learned not to expect dramatic behavior from successful spies. The most effective intelligence operations were precisely the ones that blended seamlessly into normal life, that aroused no suspicion and left no obvious traces. On April 11, 1979, at 2:17 in the afternoon, Walter Ashford arrived at Literarium Books. He carried his briefcase as he usually did. He spent approximately 8 minutes in the shop before he left. The FBI now faced a critical tactical decision. They could wait for the signal to appear in the window that evening, then wait for the pickup to occur overnight, documenting the full cycle of the operation one more time. They could also initiate their actions before Ashford had an opportunity to destroy incriminating evidence, before Caldwell could alert anyone within the network, and before whatever Ashford had delivered could be retrieved and vanish into Soviet intelligence channels. Robert Hensley, reviewing the report at FBI headquarters, pondered the available choices. They had meticulously monitored this operation for several months, gaining a comprehensive understanding of its mechanics and identifying the source. Their current objective was to secure tangible evidence, irrefutable proof that Walter Ashford was engaged in espionage. Should they delay, they risked the loss of this vital evidence. Conversely, an immediate move would grant them the advantage of surprise. Hensley made his decision. The FBI would execute arrest and search warrants without delay, preempting any potential signal or pickup. Ernest Caldwell would be apprehended at the bookshop, Walter Ashford at his residence, and both locations would be searched for evidence. Additionally, they would prepare to activate the signal themselves the following night, ideally with Caldwell's cooperation, to identify and arrest the courier. At precisely 5:35 p.m. on April 11, 1979, a team of FBI agents approached the bookshop's entrance. They had awaited the departure of the last customer to ensure no civilians were present during the arrest. Special Agent Robert Hensley entered first, prominently displaying his FBI credentials. Inside, Caldwell glanced up from the counter where he was organizing receipts. A look of puzzlement crossed his face as he noticed the group of men in suits at his door. Hensley identified himself and informed Caldwell that he was being arrested for conspiracy to commit espionage against the United States. Caldwell's complexion visibly paled. He began to stammer, but Hensley proceeded to deliver the Miranda warning outlining Caldwell's right to remain silent, his right to legal counsel, and other rights guaranteed by law. Two agents moved to the rear of the shop to confirm no one was concealed and no back exits were being used for escape. As Caldwell was being handcuffed, other agents commenced executing the search warrant, systematically examining the bookshop for the evidence Walter Ashford had dropped off earlier that afternoon. They scoured the area behind the counter, the storage closet, the small office at the back, and among the shelves and displays. The search was thorough and methodical, and within minutes, an agent called out from the storage closet. He had discovered a manila file folder. The folder was photographed in situ, then carefully removed and opened. Inside were 4 pages of photocopied documents. The agents handling the folder immediately recognized classification markings. The word "Derfor quote Noro" was stamped in red at the top and bottom of each page, and 2 were marked or quote Owapajas. A swift review indicated that the documents pertained to satellite communication systems under development by the Department of Defense, containing technical specifications and program assessments that would be immensely valuable to Soviet military planners seeking to comprehend and counter American intelligence gathering capabilities. At 6:00 p.m. that evening, concurrently with the completion of the search at Literary and Books, FBI agents carried out a simultaneous arrest at Walter Ashford's residence on Crescent Drive. A team of 6 agents approached the house, noting the interior lights were on, and Ashford's car was in the driveway. When agents knocked on the front door and announced their presence, identifying themselves as federal officers, a momentary silence emanated from within, followed by sounds of movement. The door partially opened, and Walter Ashford appeared, still wearing the business attire from his workday. His expression immediately conveyed alarm upon seeing the number of agents at his door. When the lead agent informed Ashford he was under arrest for espionage-related offenses and attempted to enter the residence, Ashford's initial reaction was to try and close the door. However, agents had positioned themselves to prevent this. Within seconds, Ashford was secured, handcuffed, and having his Miranda rights read to him in his own living room, while other agents began executing the search warrant for his residence. The search of Ashford's house yielded additional evidence that would prove critical to the prosecution. In a bedroom closet, hidden inside a shoebox beneath several others, agents found a Minox camera, a type of miniature camera synonymous with Cold War espionage. The Minox, small enough to fit in a pocket, was specifically designed for rapid and discreet document photography. Alongside the camera, agents discovered several rolls of exposed, undeveloped film. In a desk drawer in Ashford's home office, agents unearthed a spiral-bound notebook containing what appeared to be coded notations. The entries comprised dates, abbreviations, and numbers that were not immediately decipherable, but would later be interpreted by counterintelligence analysts as a record-keeping system, possibly tracking photographed or delivered documents, or recording received payments. This notebook would become significant evidence, demonstrating the systematic nature of Ashford's espionage activities over an extended period. Both Ernest Cordwell and Walter Ashford were transported separately to the FBI's Washington field office for processing and interrogation. They were placed in distinct rooms, isolated from each other, and advised of their rights before any questioning commenced. The FBI's strategy was to leverage the already acquired evidence to encourage cooperation, particularly from Caldwell, who seemed more of a facilitator than a primary actor in the espionage network, and who might be willing to provide information in exchange for leniency in sentencing. Ernest Caldwell, visibly shaken by the arrest and the gravity of the charges, requested legal counsel. When an attorney arrived within 2 hours, a private consultation took place, and the attorney clearly advised Caldwell that cooperation was his best option. Caldwell decided to provide a full statement to FBI investigators over several hours on the evening of April 11th, and continuing into the early morning of April 12th. Caldwell detailed his involvement in the espionage operation. According to Caldwell's account, approximately 3 years prior, sometime in early 1976, he had been approached by a man who identified himself only as Michael. The man was well-dressed, professional in demeanor, and initially entered the bookshop as an apparent customer before eventually engaging Caldwell in conversation. After several visits over a few weeks, Michael presented his proposal. He would pay Caldwell $500 per month in cash if Caldwell would permit his bookshop to be used for what Michael described as discreet exchanges of business documents. Michael claimed to represent corporate clients who required confidential exchange of proprietary information, suggesting the bookshop, with its low foot traffic and trusted community presence, would be an ideal neutral location for such transactions. Caldwell admitted to investigators that he had suspected from the beginning that something illicit might be involved, perhaps industrial espionage or corporate intelligence gathering, but he maintained he never imagined it involved classified government documents or Soviet intelligence operations. The financial offer was appealing. $500 a month in cash represented a considerable supplemental income for a small bookshop owner operating on narrow margins. The system Michael proposed seemed relatively simple and passive. When someone delivered material to the shop, Caldwell was instructed to place a Coca-Cola bottle, half filled with soda, in the front window display before closing for the day. The bottle was to be positioned on the right side of the window, angled slightly toward the street. This would signal that material was ready for pickup. Michael had provided Caldwell with a key to give to the person who would collect the material. That individual would enter through the back door overnight, after the shop was closed and dark, retrieve whatever had been left, and exit the same way. Caldwell's sole responsibility was to facilitate the drop-offs and activate the signal. He was not to ask questions, examine the transferred material, or have any direct involvement beyond providing access and communication via the bottle signal. Caldwell described the few instances when he had actually seen the courier, the person who picked up the material, or at least one of the couriers. It had occurred only 3 or 4 times in 3 years. These instances were when the courier had apparently chosen to enter through the front door the following day rather than the back during the night, perhaps to vary his routine, or because something about the back entrance seemed unsafe. Caldwell's descriptions were frustratingly vague. A white male, medium height and build, perhaps 35 to 45 years old. Dark, short hair, clean-shaven, with no distinguishing marks or features Caldwell could recall. The man had never spoken to Caldwell, simply retrieved the material and departed. Caldwell did not know his name, where he lived, or anything about his identity beyond these basic physical characteristics. When FBI investigators specifically asked Caldwell about Walter Ashford, Caldwell confirmed that Ashford had been the one who delivered material to the bookshop over the 3 years of the operation. Caldwell had never known Ashford's name until the FBI informed him during questioning, and he had never engaged in a genuine conversation with him, beyond brief pleasantries about books. Ashford would enter the shop, leave the material by handing it directly to Caldwell, with minimal interaction. Caldwell would subsequently put it into the storage closet and position the signal that evening before closing, with the retrieval taking place overnight. Caldwell could not recall the exact number of times Ashford had made deliveries. His memory was imprecise on this detail, but he estimated it had occurred at least a dozen times over the past 2 or 3 years. Walter Ashford's statements during interrogation significantly diverged from Caldwell's. Its distinctive glass bottles were ever present, in grocery stores and gas stations, trash bins, and recycling receptacles. The prospect of locating the one significant Coca-Cola bottle among millions of irrelevant ones seemed almost preposterous. The FBI broadened its investigation to include visual surveillance of areas considered to be of high probability, neighborhoods adjacent to Pentagon offices, commercial districts, and suburbs with substantial populations of federal employees holding security clearances. Agents were trained to observe unusual patterns, bottles placed in locations and in manners that appeared deliberate rather than accidental. However, the task was monumental, and resources were severely limited. After weeks of expanded surveillance yielding no results, the FBI leadership began to question the accuracy of the CIA's intelligence or their interpretation of it. By late September 1978, Operation Quiet Pastor had reverted to its initial focus, continuing to investigate, but lacking any clear path forward. Special Agent Michael Reeves had been assigned to the task team since its inception in early 1976, and by October 1978, the case had become somewhat of an obsession for him. Reeves, 34 years old, was a 12-year veteran of the Bureau who had previously worked on bank robbery and organized crime investigations before transitioning to counterintelligence. He possessed a methodical nature, the type of investigator who maintained meticulous notes and revisited evidence repeatedly, seeking patterns that others might have overlooked. On the evening of October 12, 1978, Michael and his wife Abigail Reeves had dinner reservations at Angelo's, a small Italian restaurant located near their home in Arlington. Arlington, Virginia, situated just across the Potomac River from Washington, D.C., was a suburb where tree-lined streets and locally owned businesses belied its proximity to the nation's most sensitive government operations. When FBI agents attempted to question him on the evening of April 11th, after informing him of his rights, Ashford disavowed any knowledge of espionage, denied transmitting classified documents, and repudiated any connection to Soviet intelligence operations. When confronted with the evidence discovered in the bookshop, the classified documents that investigators had already determined originated from his Pentagon office, Ashford claimed to be unaware of how those documents had arrived there. He suggested that he was being framed and that he had merely visited the bookshop to purchase a book, having no involvement with any classified materials. When faced with the evidence found at his home, the Minex camera, film, and notebook with encoded entries, Ashford's denials became less specific. He asserted that the camera was a gift, which he used for recreational photography, and that he had no knowledge of any codes or espionage activities. As the interrogation progressed and the growing body of evidence became increasingly difficult to refute, Ashford invoked his right to remain silent and requested legal counsel. From that moment onward, he declined to answer any further questions or offer any assistance to the investigation. With Ernest Caldwell in custody and cooperating, the FBI had an opportunity to attempt to identify and apprehend the courier who collected materials from the bookshop. The strategy was straightforward: utilize Caldwell's cooperation to place the Coca-Cola bottle signal in the window, precisely as would occur after a legitimate drop. Then position FBI agents inside literarium books overnight to arrest whoever came to make the pickup. If the courier adhered to his customary pattern and appeared in the early morning hours to retrieve what he believed was waiting material, he would instead encounter federal agents. On the evening of April 12, 1979, approximately 24 hours subsequent to the initial arrests, FBI agents meticulously prepared the operation. They desired everything to appear exactly as it would during a typical signal placement. At 6:45 in the evening, Caldwell placed a Coca-Cola bottle in the front window of Literarium Books, positioned on the right side and angled toward the street, matching the configuration previously used for signals. The shop's exterior was left precisely as it would be after Caldwell closed for the day. Lights extinguished, shades drawn, everything appearing normal and undisturbed. Inside the darkened bookshop, 4 FBI agents adopted concealed positions. 2 agents positioned themselves behind the tall bookshelves near the rear of the store, affording them clear views of both the front door and the storage area where materials typically had been left. Another agent concealed himself in the storage closet where the documents had been discovered. The 4th agent was stationed in the small office area at the back of the shop near the rear entrance, prepared to intercept anyone entering through the back door. All 4 agents were armed. Their directives were unequivocal: remain hidden, permit the courier to enter and move toward the pickup location, then identify themselves as federal agents and execute the arrest. The trap was set. Now it was a matter of waiting. The hours passed slowly in the darkened bookshop. The only sounds were the sporadic creak of the building settling, or the muffled hum of traffic from the street outside. Midnight arrived and departed, followed by 1 o'clock, then 2. The agents inside the shop maintained their positions, uncomfortable but disciplined, striving to remain absolutely still and silent, so as not to betray any indication that the building was occupied. 3 o'clock passed, then 4, then 4:30. The early morning hours, when prior pickups had consistently occurred, came and went with no sign of the courier. No vehicle appeared on the street, no figure entered the alley, no key turned in the back door. The bookshop remained empty save for the FBI agents awaiting in the darkness. By 6:30, as dawn began to illuminate the sky and early morning traffic commenced on the streets outside, it became evident that no one was coming. The FBI team maintained surveillance throughout the morning and into the afternoon of April 13th, keeping agents hidden inside the shop in case the courier appeared during daylight hours, but the outcome remained unchanged. No pickup occurred. Either the courier had somehow learned of the arrests and recognized that the signal was a trap, or there was some additional signal or communication method that the FBI had not identified, some way for the network to confirm that a drop was legitimate before attempting a pickup. Perhaps there was a secondary signal that Caldwell had neglected to mention or was unaware of. Perhaps the courier had attempted to contact Caldwell through some other channel and had been alerted when Caldwell did not respond. Perhaps the arrest of Ashford had already been noted by Soviet intelligence handlers, and they had immediately instructed all their operatives to cease activities and avoid any established drop sites. Robert Hensley, reviewing the failed operation with his team on the afternoon of April 13th, acknowledged the frustration, but also recognized the limitations of their accomplishments. They had arrested the source, who had been transmitting classified information for years. They had shut down an established drop site that had facilitated dozens of successful document transfers. They had recovered classified documents and evidence of systematic espionage. They had not apprehended the courier, but they had significantly disrupted the network. Without the bookshop serving as a functional drop site, without Walter Ashford providing new intelligence, the Soviet operation in this sector had suffered a severe blow. The case against Walter Ashford progressed through the federal court system, with the deliberate pace necessitated by espionage prosecutions. Prosecutors from the Department of Justice's Internal Security Section constructed a comprehensive case, assembling the surveillance evidence, the physical evidence recovered from the bookshop and Ashford's residence, the testimony of Ernest Caldwell, and the damage assessment conducted by Department of Defense counterintelligence analysts. That damage assessment concluded that Ashford had potentially compromised dozens of classified documents over approximately 3 years, starting sometime in 1976. The documents primarily concerned satellite communications and military procurement programs, precisely the sort of intelligence that Soviet military planners required to comprehend American capabilities and develop countermeasures. Ashford's trial commenced in October 1979 in the United States District Court for the Eastern District of Virginia. His defense attorney argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that the documents could have been placed in the bookshop by another individual, that the camera found in his residence was for legitimate personal photography, and that the prosecution could not definitively prove that Ashford had intended to pass classified information to a foreign power. However, the prosecution's case was thorough and compelling. The surveillance photographs depicted Ashford entering the bookshop. The folder found in the bookshop contained documents originating from Ashford's Pentagon office, documents to which he had access and that bore his office's document control markings. The Minox camera and unexposed film discovered in his home were consistent with espionage tradecraft. The notebook with encoded entries suggested systematic record-keeping over an extended period. Ernest Caldwell testified for the prosecution as part of his cooperation agreement, describing the operation of the drop site and affirming that Walter Ashford had been the individual who delivered material to the bookshop on multiple occasions. Caldwell's testimony was damaging, providing the jury with a clear understanding of how the espionage network had functioned and how Ashford's actions fit into that larger system. On November 8, 1979, after 6 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on all counts: conspiracy to commit espionage, unauthorized possession and transmission of classified documents, and related offenses. Walter Ashford displayed no visible reaction as the verdict was read. Sentencing occurred in January 1980, with the federal judge citing the gravity of the offenses and the damage to national security in imposing a sentence of 25 years in federal prison. Ernest Caldwell, in recognition of his cooperation and his comparatively peripheral role, received 5 years in federal prison with the possibility of parole after serving 2 years. The questions of who had recruited Walter Ashford, who the courier was, and what had transpired with the broader Soviet intelligence network largely remained unanswered. The FBI's investigation persisted for several more months after the trial, with agents endeavoring to identify the courier through analysis of surveillance photographs and by cross-referencing Caldwell's vague description with databases of known intelligence officers and suspected operatives. But without a clear photograph, without Ashford's cooperation, and without any other leads to pursue, the courier remained unidentified. Whoever he was, he had successfully eluded the FBI's trap and vanished back into whatever cover life he maintained, presumably continuing to work for Soviet intelligence in some other capacity or returning to the Soviet Union once the network was compromised. For many years following the convictions, the case stayed partly classified, with the Department of Defense asking that numerous specifics stay undisclosed to prevent revealing the complete scope of compromised documents and the particular capabilities that had come to light. For Michael Reeves, the agent whose dinner observation sparked the breakthrough, the case marked a professional peak and underscored the significance of vigilance and meticulousness in counterintelligence operations. In ensuing years, after sections of the case were declassified, Reeves would sometimes be questioned about that night at Angelo's restaurant and what prompted him to notice the Coca-Cola bottle when thousands of others had passed the same bookshop window without perceiving anything out of the ordinary. His response consistently remained the same. It wasn't brilliance or instinct. It was simply about remaining attentive to patterns and irregularities and being prepared to investigate something that appeared subtly amiss, even when it would have been simpler to disregard it as mere happenstance. Federal employees comprised a significant portion of its population, and the workings of government, with all its secrets and vulnerabilities, were interwoven into daily life. Michael and Abigail arrived at 6:45 p.m., and the hostess seated them at a table near the front window, a spot offering a view of the street and the storefronts across the way. As Agent Reeves glanced out the window while Abigail perused the menu, his attention was drawn to the bookstore directly opposite. Literarium Books was characteristic of the small, independent bookstores found in many suburban commercial districts of that era, featuring hand-lettered signs in the window, advertising used paperbacks and local author events. However, what captured Reeves's attention was not a book, but a Coca-Cola bottle positioned on the right side of the window display, filled approximately halfway with liquid. The bottle stood upright, its label angled slightly towards the street, neatly placed among some of the books on display. Reeves observed the shop owner, a middle-aged man in a cardigan sweater, moving about inside, preparing to close for the evening. The man pulled down the front shade and locked the door, but the Coca-Cola bottle remained visible through the window, illuminated by the fading evening light. Reeves felt a shift in his mind, that particular sensation recognized by experienced investigators. The moment a seemingly random detail suddenly acquires significance. He recalled the CIA intelligence report from August concerning Coca-Cola bottles used as signals. He considered how this bottle appeared deliberately placed rather than merely forgotten. He contemplated how the timing coincided with the shop's closing, as if the placement meant to convey something to someone who would see it after business hours. Throughout the meal, he intermittently glanced across the street at the bookstore window, at that half-filled bottle catching the streetlight. It was probably nothing, probably just a coincidence, but Reeves could not shake the feeling that he was observing something important. After dinner, as he and Abigail walked to their car, Reeves surveyed the street. It was empty, as most businesses had already closed for the day, and only people like himself and his wife were out for dinner and drinks. Agent Reeves did not sleep well that night. He tossed and turned, pondering the bottle in the bookstore window. At 6:45 the following morning, Michael Reeves drove slowly past Literarium Books on his way to the office. The bookstore would not open until 10s, and the street was quiet in the early morning light, with only a few commuters heading towards the main roads and a delivery truck parked 2 blocks down. Reeves slowed his car as he approached Literarium Books, looking towards the front window. The Coca-Cola bottle was gone. The window display otherwise remained unchanged. The same arrangement of books on the same wooden stands, the same hand-lettered sign advertising a poetry reading scheduled for the following week. But the bottle that had been positioned so deliberately the previous night had vanished sometime between then and now, barely 12 hours later. Reeves felt his pulse quicken. He continued to the FBI's Washington field office and immediately requested a meeting with his supervisor, Special Agent in Charge Robert Hensley. Hensley listened to Reeves's account with the patient skepticism of a career investigator who had learned not to become overly enthusiastic about isolated observations. The supervisor acknowledged that it was intriguing, but also explainable in a dozen mundane ways. The shop owner could have removed it himself. A cleaning person could have taken it out. It could be entirely unrelated to their case. But Reeves emphasized the timing aspect. It had appeared just before closing and was gone by morning. That was precisely the type of signal the CIA source had described. Place the indicator when material is ready. Remove it once pickup is confirmed. Hensley authorized limited surveillance. 2 agents would position themselves at the restaurant that night. If another bottle appeared, they would observe what transpired. If nothing happened, they would proceed differently. That evening, October 13th, 2 FBI agents undercover as a couple out for dinner sat at a corner table in Angelo's, with a clear view of Literarium Books across the street. They ordered food and settled in to watch. The bookstore operated normally, the owner visible through the front window, shelving books and managing the register. At 7 p.m., the owner flipped the sign to "Closed" and began his end-of-day routine. The agents watched carefully, but no Coca-Cola bottle appeared in the window. At 7:30 p.m., the owner locked the front door and departed, leaving the shop dark. The FBI team agreed that another drop the following night might be too soon, so they maintained surveillance for the next few random evenings, rotating agents to avoid suspicion. However, the result was the same each night. Normal business operations, routine closing procedures, no Coca-Cola bottles, no suspicious activity of any kind. By October 20th, the surveillance was called off. Hensley acknowledged that Reeves might have observed something relevant, but concluded that without additional evidence, they couldn't justify the continued allocation of resources. Michael Reeves accepted the decision professionally, but privately he couldn't let it go. The image of that bottle in the window stayed with him. The deliberateness of its placement, the timing of its appearance and disappearance. He began driving past Literarium Books regularly during his off-duty hours, sometimes in the morning before work, sometimes during his lunch break, sometimes in the evening after dinner. Weeks passed. November arrived with cooler temperatures and shorter days, and Arlington took on the character of approaching winter. Reeves continued his irregular surveillance, varying his routes and times to avoid establishing a pattern that might be noticed. He saw nothing unusual. No Coca-Cola bottles appeared in the window. But on the evening of December 8, 1978, nearly 2 months after his initial observation, Michael Reeves drove past Literarium Books at approximately 8:20 in the evening. The shop had already closed. The sign hanging in the door, the interior lights turned off, and there in the front window, positioned in exactly the same spot as before, angled in exactly the same way as before, was a Coca-Cola bottle filled halfway with liquid. Reeves pulled his car to the curb a half block away, his hands gripping the steering wheel. It wasn't a coincidence. It couldn't be coincidence. The placement was too specific, too identical to what he'd observed in October. Someone was using that bottle as a signal, and someone else was reading that signal and responding to it. He decided to call it in right away to the FBI duty officer, identifying himself and requesting immediate contact with SAC Hensley. By 10:30 that evening, Robert Hensley had mobilized a surveillance team from the Washington field office. The initial challenge was how to observe Literarium Books without being detected. The shop sat on a commercial street with limited places to conceal agents, and any obvious surveillance presence might alert whoever was using the signal system. Hensley made the decision to station 2 agents in an unmarked vehicle parked down the block, a Ford sedan that blended with other cars along the street.